Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thanks very much for joining us in this session of the C20 Virtual Summit, A Fresh Start, Charting a Just Transition for a Just Recovery. It's part of the Civil 20 Virtual Summit, and the Civil 20 is an independent engagement group of the G20, as you might know. It's a global platform for over 1,000 civil society organizations in the G20 process, delivering civil society demands to world leaders. My name's Andreas Sieber. I work with CAN International, the world's largest network of civil society organizations fighting the climate crisis. And it's really my pleasure to moderate this session, which is very timely today. With COVID, really, millions of people have been left sick, and disproportionately Black people, Indigenous peoples, and people of color, they have been left jobless, displaced, homeless, with worsening inequalities, broken health systems. And COVID has really laid bare huge inequalities in the most tragic way. And at the same time, this really could be the moment for a fresh start. Governments have spent billions of dollars on bailouts and stimulus packages in reaction to the COVID crisis, and can make or break the goal towards a safe and sustainable future with that money. And the amounts of money usually spent over decades are now issued within months, and they can save lives, make our societies more just, increase inequality, save jobs, or they can or they can pave the way to reach the Paris goals or break the temperature goals we have in there. However, what we have seen is also a lot of criticism over the G20 in the past months, with over $100 billion in unconditional fossil fuel bailouts since the start of the COVID crisis from the G20 countries. A debt standstill for poor countries has been issued, but at the same time, these are countries who usually cannot just inject money into their economy without risking hyperinflation. So with that really dire and at the same time interesting time and situation, we want to explore with this panel how a fresh start can actually look like. And I'm really glad and humbled to be in the presence of this panel, which includes Hindu Umaru Ibrahim from the Association of Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, who's a permanent representative to the Forum of Indigenous Peoples, Samantha Smith from the Just Transition Center, Sven Hameling from CARE International, Harjeet Singh, who's the climate lead from ActionAid, and Mustafa Kamal Gouye, who works on the Green Jobs program from the International Labour Organization. So welcome, thanks so much for joining. I'm really humbled, and I would now actually give the floor to all these speakers for their opening remarks. And in the situation we are now in, I would like to ask them to come up with one headline they would like to see in 1 year from now. And I would first love to give the floor to Hindu. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Andre. And hi, everybody. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be in this C20 while there are G20 that going in opposition, in the other way where it is not open for all of us. So I'm so glad that as peoples and as real peoples, we are having our own discussions and vision on how we can turn over what is happening. So today, we all know that health of our planet and the strength of our political and economic system are tested. We also know that from climate change to the pandemic, we are all under threat, and our government and society do not respect the one thing we have in common, the nature. And this is making us in a big threat more than the economic that they are thinking about it, or they are just having that in the mind in their daily life. So there is no sustainable economy without sustainable nature. And I can give you the example in my country, Chad, just like the last 20 years, we used to have 36% of forest cover. And now more than 11% that just lost. For us, it is not the trees that lost. It is all the biodiversity with it. It is the more than 9 megaton of carbon emission that lost. It is life of the peoples. It is livelihood of the peoples. It is the peoples that die from all the threat of flooding that we are experiencing actually now to the 4 months before the drought and the heat that we experienced there. So from the extreme weather to another one. And the indigenous peoples, as you said well, Andre, in your introduction, indigenous peoples, of course, then Black peoples and all discrimination, we are the front line of all those crises. And suddenly this is not really favoring the inequality between the peoples, between the communities. So that's leaving many of us behind all the decisions that have been taken just in our back. We see that after the centuries and thousands of living in harmony, in balance with our nature, as indigenous peoples, we know how to do that. But we are struggling because of the action, or I can say inaction of the goodwill of those government or private sectors. We see how Arctic, Amazon, Sahel regions where I'm living, we all facing the same environmental crisis. And we all read or just watch on the TVs how much species that we lost. When they say it is the number, 60%, for us who are living there, it is not only the numbers, it is the realities. Because the species that we used to see with our eyes, and I can witness that, all the birds, the insects that disappear, and they disappear forever. Not money can take them back, or not power can take them back. So those laws, we don't want to have them in continuous way. And that's why it is very important that to end the fossil fuel, but ending right now, to move from all this dirty energy to the sustainable energy. There is no excuse. There are all the possibility to do it. There is all the technology that's going on. Then I'm sure that our colleagues from the technology and research can tell us more about it. But the most important, as indigenous peoples, we have our indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge that can help a lot. And we all know if even we stop the greenhouse gases emissions by stopping the fossil fuel, we cannot reach the Paris goal on 1.5. If we do not put the 30% of the nature-based solutions. And for indigenous peoples, when everyone starts talking about nature-based solution for the future, it is not selling our nature that we are talking about it. It is investing on indigenous peoples that can protect better the 80% of the remaining biodiversity. So my 1 year from now headline, I can say that all the leaders across the world, from government, private sector, development agencies, must to focus on what is the nature-based solutions and invest on indigenous peoples who are the engineers and doctors of the nature in order to achieve the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hindu, for that inspiring opening speech and also for your headline and vision. Next, we would have Mustafa Kamal from the International Labour Organization. Thanks so much for joining us. And we would also love to hear the headline you would like to see in a year from now.
Thank you very much, Andres and colleagues, for the opportunity to join you in this session. What I would like to see as a headline a year from now is that the world has realized that productive economies, decent work, and safe working environment all depend on a healthy and stable environment. So that we realize that there is an intrinsic relationship between nature, people, and the way we produce and run our economies. We cannot disconnect the health crisis we are in now with the collapse that is looming of our ecosystems and the huge challenge of climate change, that these are all interconnected. And I think this is something that we hope to see a year on from a realization of the leadership, but of people around the world. So that's what I would want to see. So if you want me to elaborate now, just a few points that I think is critical, that colleagues, we all have realized how the COVID-19 pandemic has hugely disrupted the work of work. People around have lost their jobs, their income, and so it's not something you just read on the newspapers. I mean, it is something that each of us has experienced in some capacity. Being locked into houses and not being able to work, go outside. But I want to say that many of us have the luxury that even being able to work from our homes, get our salaries, our means of livelihoods. There are many billions of people outside who do not have that luxury. They need to go out to the streets on a daily basis to earn their living. And this is 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy that have been impacted because of that. And people had to make choices between staying at home and not having income and means to live, or going outside and expose themselves to the health risks of being contaminated. So we therefore must come out of this crisis with the realization that the way our economies function today is simply unacceptable. There's 70% of us on this planet that do not have access to adequate or even not at all social security, which means that in situations of lockdown like this, there are people who can't have any means of income and livelihoods. So therefore, this is one key item we have to take forward, making sure that people have minimum ways of earning a living, entering a wide coverage of social security, so that we have a fairer, a more equitable and just a society. And then to end, what we should realize, and I think this has been made very clear by the UN Secretary General in his response on the socio-economic impacts of the crisis, that the world and leaders, including the G20, must drive a green recovery. We cannot come out of a crisis driven by a health pandemic and just be negligent to something we know is going to happen, which is the climate crisis and the crisis of ecosystems with biodiversity. I think this must be a green recovery that makes workers, enterprises, and the world of work in general more resilient to future shocks, so that we don't find ourselves in a reactive situation. I think we should be much more preemptive, and there are means to do that. There is knowledge on how to do it. I think what is missing is the political will, the leadership, and I think this is where G20 countries have a good opportunity to lead the world and prevent disruption of a scale that we see today. And we know that it would be much bigger, much more painful than what we have seen today.
Thank you so much. And it is very fitting. Right after you have Samantha Smith from the Just Transition Center. So Samantha, please kick us off and also tell us your headline you'd like to see in a year from now.
Sure. And just to say what the Just Transition Center is, we're part of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents more than 200 million organized workers in 162 countries. And I guess it'll surprise no one that we agree with Kamal, right? I think I'm just going to build on what you said, Kamal. Coming into the crisis, just before the crisis, ITUC carried out a global poll covering 16 countries with more than half of the world's population. And what we learned from that is that this crisis comes on top of huge existing crises of inequality, low wages, and insecure jobs, in addition to climate change. People were angry, desperate, frightened, not knowing how they would make ends meet before the pandemic started. Most people didn't have savings or safety net. And so millions of people came into COVID-19 with a choice between working and starving. And during the course of the pandemic so far, hundreds of millions of jobs have disappeared, more than 400 million. And in addition to that, hundreds of millions of livelihoods in the informal sector. So it's not too surprising that in this context, what people want, if they had work, if they had livelihoods and jobs in February, they are desperate. to either to remain employed or to get back to the work and employment that they had. And that can explain some of the reactions we've seen from governments, political leaders, with a strong desire just to sort of turn the economy back on the way it was in February. But we know that's not going to work. And we also know that even that economy was pretty bad. We need a new social contract. And another thing that we have learned from our polling and from our conversations with our members, with other working people, is that people are desperate for change. They will support change. And in a new social contract, what they want is they want, first of all, jobs, good jobs, decent, secure jobs with higher wages. People need a pay raise. They want social protection. As Mustafa said, we have 70% of working people in the world who have no social safety net. That is unacceptable. More than 2/3 of people we polled want action on climate change. They want a just transition for workers and communities. We see record high polling in favor of organized labor. People want the right to join a union. They want unions to protect them in their fights with employers and with governments. They want everyone to pay their fair share in taxes. They understand that the world is mostly being run at this point by wealthy governments and corporations. And they're losing trust in political leadership and even in democracy because they see it's not delivering for most people, that is poor and working class people. Huge investments are needed not only to ward off the worst effects of climate change, but also to invest in jobs and care, because another thing that we've seen in this crisis is that care workers, other essential workers, transport workers, people working in agriculture, they're perhaps the most important workers in a crisis. And we need caring for older people, disabled people, and also for children. In terms of a headline we'd like to see a headline, G20 governments agree a massive new social contract. And right up there with that, we would also like to see that there is a vaccine, that it is free, that it is available to every single person who needs to be vaccinated. Both of those things would be really welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I'm sure we'd all love to see these two headlines and hope they become reality. Next, we have Sven Hameling with his opening statements from CARE International. Sven, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation. I think it's extremely timely. Before I get to the headline, I will get to that in the end of my input. I would like to briefly share my screen because what I'm going to be talking about is mainly related to a report which CARE released last week. You may know CARE is working in more than 90 countries, many of them among the poorest and most vulnerable. And one thing we've seen over the last months is, of course, how the impacts of the climate crisis basically build on top of the adverse impacts of COVID-19 and the economic situations there, how people who had tried to protect them from, for example, cyclones in Bangladesh or India or other countries, how it has been even more difficult than usually to find protection in the situation of needs of social distancing, reduced services from public protection agencies because of lockdowns, etc. We have seen delayed disaster response because of challenges in the logistics around COVID-19. And all of this is just basically showing how much needs to happen now as a response to this double crisis. And the previous speakers have already addressed a number of key aspects in terms of the, let's say, the challenging or bad world we're coming from to some extent, with a lot of inequality, with big income gaps. And we also see in particular with a high level of gender inequality in many countries where women are still marginalized in many areas, where there are big barriers and boundaries to become an active part of the workforce in various areas. So these are some of the aspects we looked into our report. Building forward, create a more equitable, gender just, inclusive and sustainable world. And I only want to highlight a few aspects from the climate related research we've been doing. And I think one of the conclusions from our side has been, of course, that decision makers must take bold and comprehensive approach to this crisis, which pays special attention to women's economic justice and rights, to green and gender just recovery, and also to humanitarian response forms, because all of these mechanisms are extremely important in the situation of crisis. One thing we found out, drawing on other research, of course, that the annual fossil fuel subsidies are at a scale equivalent to 20 to 30 times the estimated adaptation costs in developing countries by 2030. And also about 170 times the estimated annual humanitarian finance needs. So there's a lot of money going to the wrong direction, to a direction which further accelerates climate change, while at the same time it could serve a lot of the key important needs that we've identified. We've also looked into some of the reviews of recovery packages and how green or brown they are. And on the one hand, of course, most of the analysis shows that the majority of G20 countries is not performing very well when it comes to shifting course here. But one particular aspect we looked into was also to what extent these measures apply a gender differentiated approach. And basically in a database of 350 measures, we didn't find one measure which explicitly, for example, try to bring women into green workforce or reduce barriers in that regard, or particular set incentives in that areas. But at the same time, we've been seeing that there are a lot of synergies possible between green recovery strategies and measures to address COVID, whether it's about health systems run on renewable energies, early warning systems to protect against disasters, climate resilient agriculture. There are many solutions which can be promoted much more actively, and including those which also, if done in a targeted way, can overcome barriers for women to play a stronger role in this green shift and in the workforce related to that. So if the headline I can imagine for next year is basically that G20 countries might say, or the media might say, billions of dollars of fossil fuel subsidies redirected into green recovery in a way that brings millions of people, in particular women, into the workforce. I know it's been a bit long for a headline, but that's the idea. Yeah, I look forward to the further conversation and discussion, and was happy to share some of our findings here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sven. And I would now directly hand over to your colleague, Harjeet, from ActionAid for his opening statement before we move into a discussion, and before we then later also enable those watching us today to ask questions and raise points in the chat.
Thanks, Andreas. I hope you can see my screen. Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel. So as we are talking about just transition and just building on what other panelists have already covered, I'm going to focus a bit more on agriculture. So just a couple of slides to give a bit of background. We all know how COVID affected farmers in particular and agriculture as a sector. We saw how markets were closed and food was wasted, and how it impacted small-scale food producers, local markets, as well as food supplies. And we are already on the verge of seeing a food crisis already happening. Hunger is rising. And we've seen loss of income, economic uncertainty, and it is going to now affect long-term food security of people around the world, particularly in developing countries. And all this has happened when climate was already battering crops. And on top of it, COVID has made things much more worse for them. But it's important to understand that what pandemic did, it only aggravated some of the pre-existing drivers of acute food insecurity that we have already been seeing in several regions for years and decades. And we had not fixed those problems, and COVID exacerbated some of those situations. So as we talk about green and just recovery, it is very important to highlight that it's not just a doom and gloom story. We do have solutions. We know agroecology and promoting local markets are the real solutions, which can transform food systems in response to COVID as well as climate. And what we urgently need is support for that kind of a just and green recovery. Now, these solutions are not only helpful in reducing emissions, but they can also provide food sustainably to the entire world. But the reality is that governments are right now busy bailing out big polluting agribusinesses. I think that's where the challenge is. And we see what happens because of that. We see how land and wealth gets concentrated if we continue to support these big businesses. And it also weakens resilience of poor communities and also increases risks to both COVID as well as climate. But we definitely need just transition in agriculture. Why? Because agriculture is one of the major sectors that contributes greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, it's also a victim of climate change impacts. And we also know that when we make a shift, it's going to cause major disruption. And the way major corporations are controlling food sector, they are going to feel demonized. They are going to be getting a lot more defensive. And that's where they are going to block climate action. And I think that we need to understand as this global community that as we adopt just transition, a sector like agriculture, who's going to be the biggest barrier when we already know what the solutions are? And especially, how do we fix the existing inequalities in the food system? Simplistic climate solutions are not going to work. We know that there are land grabs that are going to happen if we allow some of the so-called solutions to prevail. And if we don't support smallholder farmers, who play a very important role, and particularly women, who are 43% of the agriculture economy in the global south, but their role has not been recognized. So how do we involve them in this just transition? And currently, while we talk of just transition, there is very limited understanding of how to do it in the agriculture sector, which employs majority of people in developing countries. So as ActionAid, we have come up with 4 key principles. So it's about addressing inequality. It's about transforming the food system that works for people, nature, and climate, and inclusiveness. Unless we involve people, we will not be able to call it just transition. And we need a comprehensive framework. We can't just look at one strand and only look at it from the environmental perspective. So yeah, finally, it's not just what we do, but about how we do it. So both process and outcome are equally important. So there's a huge opportunity that exists when it comes to just transition, and COVID opens even more doors. While there are risks, but there are more opportunities. So how do we really involve public? And it's very easy for us to connect people with food. And we have seen that during COVID times. So people do start realizing where the food is coming. And it's an excellent opportunity to now involve them to bring that fundamental shift that is required. So we have come up with a couple of papers, this principles for just transition in agriculture last year, and we are right now revising it. And we have also responded to COVID in terms of how we look at right to food. So yeah, that's an area that we are getting into. And your question, Andreas, on the headline, I would say that how G20 agrees to a new food system on production and consumption that works for people, nature, and climate. That's my headline.
Thanks very much, Harjeet. And thanks very much, everyone, for setting the scene. And I think that there has been an incredible richness of topics covered already. But I want to pick up on a few of those and start with what Sven mentioned, that a huge amount of fossil fuels subsidies that countries are issuing. And at the same time, what you, Samantha, and Mustafa mentioned, that people understandably just want to have their jobs. And I think one of the most prominent debates may be around like bailing out companies and on the other hand, kind of future jobs almost as conflicting goals. I wanted to kind of ask you, when we look at the kind of policies we see and the situation right now, what you as experts on labor would envision as kind of policies or measures in the situation in response to that. So Samantha, Mustafa.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for starting with the hard question. Hey, so look, what has happened is that all of these jobs have disappeared right? There's a crisis of supply and demand, not just in the sectors you would expect, like in, for example, the auto sector, manufacturing, and so on, but also even in electricity, right? The whole economy shrank pretty dramatically during these lockdowns, and we're not even talking about the informal economy yet. Ordinarily, for a just transition for all of these different sectors, you would be talking about a process that's taking place over years, right? Because that is actually what it takes if we're going to get down to near net zero emissions or super low emissions, which is what is necessary for climate change. So we're in this situation where we know what needs to be done to create good new jobs. The technology is there for every single sector. We know what kind of social protection systems we need, but we don't have them because this crisis has happened, as I said, off the back of pretty much everything going in the wrong direction for working people. There is no contradiction between decarbonizing the economy or meeting climate targets and creating good jobs. There's like a huge amount of research, but also practical experience that we have in the labor movement with helping unions to negotiate just transition agreements at all different scales, right? You can do this. It's possible. The question is about time. And right now, if we're talking to our members or to any other working person, people have two things they care about. They care about jobs and they care about social protection, as Mustafa said. If governments can manage to, I think in this period, we're seeing how big the state can be, right? Like all this money that was never on the table for any of the things that we wanted for climate change or anything else, suddenly it's all there. I think if governments, but also companies can cough up the political will and the cash to produce decent jobs that bring down emissions that are available now, and also to provide social protection, we'd be having a really different discussion. So I just want to say that the discussion that we're having is not framed by working people or by unions, it's framed by capital holders and by governments, right? They're telling us, you can't have this because we can't afford it and it would be too hard. But if what's on the table changed, then also like the ease of transition would change. So it is all about starting with people's core concerns, like keeping themselves and their families afloat, having decent work, having healthcare and pension and access to all the things we need in this crisis. And you look at what kind of climate action you can have within that frame, there would be no contradiction and we'd be moving pretty quickly on this.
Thanks, Samantha. Please, everyone, feel free to comment, of course, as well. And I think that already gave us some nice cues. And with the amount of money being issued now, really being somewhat unprecedented, I think Hindu earlier on already mentioned that there is no equal representation in making these decisions. So Hindu, I would pose the question to you and maybe also to you, Harjeet, when you mentioned that big agribusiness is maybe more involved than farmers on the ground. What kind of decision making or maybe process would you envision to better respond to needs on the ground and get the transition you envision?
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, all the decisions that make it excluded the real peoples that living in the nature, in connection with the nature. It can be at the international level. It's always like a country driving, and then they are like have the process that exclude the other peoples who are not being in the government. And at the national level, it is the same. Always the government decide and then go to the communities implement it. It is the same from private sectors. They take the peoples who are like indigenous peoples or local communities, the people who have them life linked to the land, who are producers. Like just they do not take care of these decisions. We take care of the decision and you implement it. So they used to have as clients or as beneficiaries. So that's why I say we cannot continue this kind of decision making. We are not beneficiaries. We wanted to be a partners. If we didn't design any program or plans, it cannot be implemented the same way. We need to design it. So how we can take part in this decision making? At the international level, it is not time of negotiation in anything, not in our health, not in our environment, not in our economy. So it is time of implementing the equity, the justice. And what's meaning equity? It's giving the chance of everyone to sit in the tables, to decide of what is happening. And I give you the simple example of when they decide about like just giving clean water to one communities. Maybe it is not the clean water who is our priorities. Maybe it is food. So if we are not in the tables, they decide, they think it is good for us, but it is not our priorities. So that's why when we come at the decision-making table and the international level, so we can take the decision. At the national level, it is the same. When they organize workshop or consultations, it's always happening in the towns. How about the people who are in the rural areas? Because they do not speak the language that they used to use, like French, English, Arabic, or whatever. It's not. We pass this way of just a language can be the barriers or region can be the barriers. And that's why they develop the technology also. So peoples can have the decentralized decision making. So that's how it can work. And especially on the indigenous people's way. We are organized in our 7 socio-cultural regions. We have our system of governance. We have our elders. We have our youth. We have our women. So everything is already organized. It's just a matter of having a political will to include the peoples to the decision making to reduce this inequality and to fight this injustice. So it is really possible to do it. But Hajar, for sure, we'll add on this one because we have the same ideas on how the indigenous peoples, local communities can really be sitting in the tables.
Yes, Harjeet, I thought of you. Please add
Absolutely.
to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, can't agree more with Hindu. I think it's really important to see communities right at the center. Indigenous people, women and young people, how they have a say in what is happening right now and what is required to transform the food systems. As Sam was saying, there's a lot of money now available, unprecedented amounts of money. But we need to track where this money is going. Who is taking away the major pot? And as we speak, what's happening in India when it comes to farmers, in the name of freedom, they are being offered open market system, and the government system is being destroyed as part of a law. And we will see that farmers will be left at the mercy of big corporations. And there are major protests happening right now. We've heard stories from Kenya on how smallholder farmers are not being supported, but the floral industry, which is massive in Kenya, as we know, they are the ones who are taking away money in the name of COVID packages and support. So really the inequality that exists is being further exacerbated, is being further widened, and we are seeing major corporations taking away most of the money, when at this very moment, what farmers need is much more protection and support and security. They need better weather services and early warning systems, especially when it comes to how they are dealing with climate change. They need better infrastructure, which should be an investment from the government side. That's not happening. They need better agriculture-related input systems like irrigation and seed. That's not being provided. So instead, they are being left at the mercy of major corporations who are going to make much more money now using COVID as an opportunity. I think that needs to be challenged. And this is where G20 can play a very important role. And India, is one of the G20 countries. And if we are not setting the right example, I think that's not good for G20, and that's not good for the world.
Thanks, Archid, and you kind of, I think you tapped on a major theme, resilience, and Sven earlier on also tapped on adaptation and the need to finance that, and actually also that there would be some money on the table. So I would love to hand over to Sven again to maybe reflect on where and what kind of projects and policies he envisions in that area of adaptation and resilience, and explore on that a bit more, building on Harjeet.
Yeah, thank you. I think on the one hand, one thing which we many probably haven't looked into enough is the synergies that we also have. I mean, there are now so many solutions which can be powered by renewable energies, which basically help increase the resilience, whether it's of local communities or entire developing countries. I mentioned some elements in my earlier statement, whether it's about powering early warning systems, which you need to adapt the timing, for example, of your harvest to the expected weather situations, which you need to protect yourself from disasters. There are other technical solutions which can help you store and dry your food in a solar-based manner, so to say. And I think there are many more examples, and they haven't received enough attention. Sometimes they've been just put into the solar box or into the mitigation box, and countries maybe haven't taken enough attention to that. But I think it's something which needs to come out more clearly, and can be part of much bigger investments in the sense of both governments in developing countries with the resources, scarce resources, I know they often have, but where they can look how they can support this. But it's also an issue, of course, for development aid and climate finance. One thing we also called for in our report, I didn't touch on it in detail, is that what must not happen is, of course, a decline or a step away from those finance commitments. We know all the legal obligation backgrounds, but also from a moral perspective, this is needed even more than in the past. And there are so many, again, synergies with what needs to be done to respond to the current economic consequences of the COVID-19 measures. And I think this must be rolled out much more in many countries, and become part of the recovery packages as they are designed. And I see that probably various governments will look into, you may call it a second generation sort of recovery packages, also knowing, of course, that many countries haven't even been in the position to do a first set of these packages. But I think there is now the time, there's now much more knowledge available to promote these solutions in a much more targeted sense.
Thanks very much, Sven, and it's good to hear that the solutions are out there. And it brings me back a bit to something Mustafa Kemal has mentioned at the start, the kind of lack of political will he actually sees in the G20. So in with all the solutions we already have heard, and the well, maybe also lack of it, maybe we can go a bit more in that direction as well. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Kamal. Why maybe that political will is lacking, or where do you see the opportunities to change that? And then also, please, everyone else come in. I think, yeah, kind of examining that gap between the headlines you mentioned and the reality we face in, would be great to hear more on this.
Well, thank you. I think from my perspective, there are two dimensions to it. When people elect their leaders, it's because they are tasked to lead society for better living conditions, to improve economic and social conditions. So that is a responsibility. And anybody going for political positions should be prepared to do that. If not, why would you want to lead a country or even a village if you're not really determined to improve their living conditions, prevent risks that may make life more difficult for people? But the other side I have seen in the COVID pandemic is that people are not waiting for political leaders to do things for themselves. You know, if you just see across Africa how young women and men have reacted to the pandemic, where there was need for local solutions to wash your hands in a way with handless touch systems. People have found solutions. They have developed, they've innovated. We saw so many of these tailors and all these artisans who, for purpose of keeping business continuity, went on to fabric masks and medical equipment for the communities. So what is demonstrated is that there is a huge capacity to innovate, and we have seen very interesting solutions, from African young, across the world, young women and men with innovative solutions. And as Harjib was talking about just transition in agriculture, what we have also seen with the lockdown and the breaking down of global supply chains, including for food, many have turned back into urban farming, even beyond rural areas in cities from Amsterdam to Paris to Bangkok, Singapore. People have gone to see how they can farm their own food, through urban farming. And I think this is a very interesting move where you can mobilize associations, communities, even in urban settings, to produce food locally through local markets. And this could be part of the food production systems. If you just take the case of Singapore, they have set a target that by 2030, 30% of the nutritional needs of Singapore would be met through urban farming, because people realize that you cannot depend totally on global markets for things that are so essential to human life, like medicine, essential medicine, food. We're not questioning globalization, that we need to have open world markets, but I think leaders and people in communities have realized that one needs to have some degree of self-production, self-sufficiency in food, health, and essential things. And I think that what is required of leaders is to support this move. I see personally a huge opportunity to spur entrepreneurship in Africa, and we're working on a partnership for action on the green economy, where we've got a generous contribution from Germany to support green recovery. Now, across the 20-page countries, what we're discussing is how could we identify all these innovative ideas that came through the reaction to the COVID-19 and support them to grow, so that you have a green recovery with economic growth that is inclusive, driven by local communities, local enterprises, and that will make everybody benefit, not just get all this money, as we're saying, go to big business and all those companies, but the people who in their communities have shown that there are solutions that are viable, can address health, address environmental issues, create decent work, and share prosperity within communities. So I think this is an important part of our debate, that we expect leaders to do things, but people have shown that they have their own ways to create wealth, to respond to risk, and take care of their own life and conditions. So this is something that leaders must be aware of, and it is their responsibility to support this movement.
Yeah, maybe I'll just build on what you said, Mustafa, and also say a few things about what nonetheless leaders could do in multilateral action, right? Because some of the issues that we're seeing are the result of a kind of destructive globalization as opposed to a sustainable globalization, and are the result of decades of systems that have sucked resources and labor out of developing countries. So that now suddenly, when global supply chains are getting unwound almost overnight, we can just think about what happened in the garment sector and in Bangladesh, that suddenly people are there without social protection, without any kind of jobs, not even getting paid for work they've already done. And there are no solutions. And strangely, there's also no money from the brands or companies that have been profiting from people's labor. And indeed, people are resourceful. Again, people are also desperate and angry. And leaders would be well advised to have that in mind when they're either trying to get elected or trying to govern now. People want change. That was super clear from all of the polling that we did. They wanted change before the crisis, and now they really want change. And conversely, if leaders are bold and listening to citizens and residents, they'll have a lot of support for an ambitious change agenda. Some of the things that could be done multilaterally that are harder to do potentially just within a country. One is debt relief for developing countries. We don't just mean postponement of debt, we mean cancellation of debt or changing the terms of debt, but definitely not just postponing debt and sort of adding to the debt burden of developing countries, but real debt relief. I think a second thing, and to pick up on something you talked about earlier, Mustafa, is we're advocating for a global fund for social protection for people in the least developed countries or in the poorest countries. Because one thing we have seen in this crisis is that if you don't have some level of income support during a crisis like this, if you're an informal worker, let's say you're a waste picker or you're an agricultural worker, there's a lockdown, you can't work, you and your family are starving, there has to be something more. It's just unacceptable that we have people starving in this crisis because we're trying to maintain public health and keep people safe from the disease. Other things that are essential, I mean, safety at work should be a fundamental right. That's something we're fighting for in the ILO. And we've seen, again, that many people in this crisis had no choice between going to work and being exposed to a potentially deadly disease, or staying home and losing whatever work they had. You know, we have the multilateral development banks. The G20 could be filling up those multilateral development banks. They could be committing to funding for developing countries consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals, with labor standards, with human and labor rights, also stimulating the creation of green jobs. We're not really seeing that happen, right, on an international basis. And these are all things that the G20 could easily commit to. I guess the last thing, just thinking about the headline we would all like to see, like where are the biggest commitments for universal access to treatment and to vaccines, right? Like we're not to name any names, but some people get COVID-19 and they get the best and the latest in treatment, and they're paid for by the state. Other people get COVID-19 and they're dying at home with their family members. So that's not right. This is a disease that strikes everybody, apparently. So we should have universal access to treatment and to vaccines. I think the last thing about political will is I keep returning to an event that I attended a while back, where then former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan spoke, and he was talking about climate change, and he talked about a saying that leaders must lead, because if they don't lead, the people will lead, and they will make leaders follow. And I think about that all the time in this year of disruption and of social fractures coming to light, right? It's important that leaders take their responsibility to lead seriously, and that they take people's fears and concerns seriously. Also about climate change, also about inequality. If they don't, they may find themselves in the position of following a very active citizenry. So we in the labor movement, we along with other parts of a civil society, we are a structure that reaches a lot of people, right? We can reach and mobilize a lot of people. We can negotiate solutions and things like that. Governments would be well advised to work with us and to work with other civil society organizations to structure this fresh start, as opposed to thinking of their own solutions that just revitalize the fractured economy we had before this crisis started. Thanks.
I mean, I wanted to jump in this point because I hear from the introduction to all the discussion with, especially from Samantha and my brother Mustafa, that talking about the social security. I mean, but I have to come in this point. When you say social security, I think it's really for some of the people who define in a very registered job. It is not applying for the majority of our peoples, our communities. Yes, it's not at all apply. The peoples who do not already register, the economy do not recognize what they are doing, all the work that they are doing. Take the pastoralists in the Sahel. Who of them have the registration and who have the social security? And non-government is caring about giving them the social security or not. The community who do not have access to the hospitals, to the clean water for drinking, and coming to earlier what Mustafa said, how they can just wash them hands 4 times a day just during the crisis of COVID. It is the same time coming to the climate change impact, where there is no fertile land, people fighting to get access just to the piece of land or to the piece of water for them communities. So we do not talk about the social security at all. So I think like maybe the social security can apply for developed countries or for the countries, developing countries, just to the people who are working in the big towns. But those who are the majority on the rural area are left at completely from the social security. And that creates also the injustice when they talk about all the billions around the COVID, talking about the green recovery that they wanted to invest. They are going to channel it to the already well-organized infrastructures. That's why they wanted to put all the money into the business, because so all those industries are organized, and a little bit of this money maybe to the individuals or a small collective entrepreneurs. And when we say where are the part of the peoples on the rural areas who are just farming from them daily best to eat, the peoples who are pastoralists, the peoples who are fishermen, are they going just to give them like $1,000 each in them hands? I don't think so. Are they going to say just organize yourself and then we give you like materials? I don't think so. So this system, for me, it's not working. It is already excluding many of the peoples. So how they can reorganize this system to benefit those who are left behind always, who are the most impacted always. It can come from the COVID. It can come from climate change, biodiversity, or even malaria that's happening. The most impacted are always the front line of all those crises. So I don't want to continuously talking about we wanted to get included or taken into consideration, because this system is not working at all. How we can redefine it and make it the just transitions, but the real transitions for the peoples and by the peoples. So the decentralization need to happen. And we do have the solution. That's my second point. When also we talk about innovations, knowledge, of course we do have innovation in knowledge. And they are not in the same way or the same equality. The peoples on indigenous communities, when you go to Amazon, they do not also have, as in Chad, in my country, the same coverage of the internet. It is the same. So are we talking about the development access or not? They don't have even this system of coverage of internet. So not electricity. But what they have who are the unique is the traditional knowledge that we do. With our knowledge, we build the resilience in our communities, even without all the development, or the technology that's going. But the scientists or the develop or whatever, they do not see our innovation and knowledge are the real science or innovations. They always wanted to say, we need to reconfirm what you have. And I had this discussion last week, earlier this week, actually, with the group of IPCC and IPBS, where we was discussing about indigenous people's traditional knowledge to climate adaptation and mitigation. They say they need a scientist who go and record and confirm the knowledge of indigenous peoples. Do you see the behavior we have in these centuries? So when we act like that, there is no change at all that will come on the coming years. Because the knowledge of indigenous peoples, who are the centuries and thousands of knowledge, like my grandmother, when she started growing up, she already learning all those knowledge until she becoming elder of 90 or 60 years. So is it someone who went to school for 20 years because he know how to write English, French, or Arabic, or he's called it Dr. something, he have PhD, who can come to my grandmother and confirm her knowledge? Is it really logic? I don't think that it's logic. So that's why we need this system to understand that it is not only one system who can work for our world. We need to adapt for the daily basis, and the knowledge of indigenous peoples are the science knowledge that build the resilience of the peoples for centuries, who do not need the science to confirm it, who need just the recognition into the equal way. And then we can build the confidence, and we can build a partnership and move all together. And we can go beyond all what we are thinking maybe can work for the developed world, can work also for the developing and for indigenous peoples. Our system are the ones who are confirming our planet is living in harmony with us. So we need all to learn from those old systems.
If I may, well, I think, Hindu is making a very, very pertinent point here, about looking for solutions that are workable in local conditions and local contexts. But it's also important that we bear in mind that, when we talk about universal access to social security, it is universal. So the point is that everybody, wherever they live, have right to social security. It is the reality that the systems as they exist today do not deliver and respond to that right. So it's not a matter of social security being only a right for developed countries or in emerging and developing economies only for organized enterprises. The farmer, the fisherman, women at home, everybody has a right to social security. Now the challenge is that our system is delivering that right only to 30% of us on this earth. 70% have no or have inadequate social security. And that's the challenge. So the battle about universal access to social security is about that. Now, how could we use this opportunity of this crisis and the way to respond to put it as a stronger message that this is unacceptable, that we keep living in a world where so many people have not at all social security. So therefore, there are many ways to think about it, also being mindful of the cost implications, the mechanisms that work. And that's why there is this idea of social protection floors, so that we don't say that you need to give the same type system to everybody, but there must be a minimum level of social security, which we call social protection floors, that everybody should be entitled to and should have. This is a right for people. It is a responsibility of governments and leaders to deliver, and that's the fight. So we're in it together, and I think I agree with the context, but we must be, very clear and determined on the right for everybody to social security.
Thanks, Mustafa. And next would be Harjeet, who I think wants to respond, but I want to take the opportunity to quickly say again to our audience, you can post questions in the chat box next to where you're watching this. And then actually after Harjeet's intervention, we'll come to your questions. And really, this is your chance to ask the expert and get your questions answered. So Harjeet.
Yeah, very quickly, let me just underline a couple of points that have been made. I think it's important that we talk about systems and not one system. no doubt that we need universal social protection, but it's important to recognize the diversity of systems and actions that are required to happen in a very decentralized manner. I think that's where the discussion also needs to go. Are we looking at different kinds of communities and different kinds of issues that they are facing, and how they can be part of that transition process, which has to be just. And it cannot be just unless and until we address the inequalities that exist. And the example that Hindu was giving of pastoralist communities or fisher folk community, they have different sets of issues, so they have different requirements. So even if we demand a universal system, how that addresses different needs and different realities is something that is needed. And coming to G20, I think it's really important to see whether G20 can really set the direction where these inequalities are addressed, and in light of COVID and climate realities that we are facing, and the economic depression that's already at our door. So we need to press G20 leadership on saying it, whose side they are. Are they going to be solving issues of these pastoralist and fishing communities and farming communities, or they are going to be again taking sides with these big multinational and transnational corporations? I think that's the big question that they need to ask, and that's where they can set the direction, and that's where we really demand leadership from them. And then we need to really watch what kind of policies they are going to put forward to change these systems. And in particular, if I talk about food systems, whether those systems are going to work with those smallholder farmers, women and young people, and where these resources are going. I think that those are the questions that we need to be asking when it comes to G20 leadership and what actually they do. It's easy to come and talk and then go back and not doing anything which has a lasting impact on people's day-to-day lives.
Thanks, Archid. And picking up on your point, whose side are the G20 on? We have a question from the audience that says, how realistic is it to expect the rolling out of plans such as Green New Deal across the G20 countries? And Sven, you earlier on mentioned a couple of things you would envision around fossil fuel subsidies, which were promised to be phased out back in 2009, and debt relief was mentioned. So maybe I wanted to pass that question to you. How realistic do you think that is, and maybe where you see the contrast and what you would actually envision?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's a fair and important question. We know there have been certain, let's say, commitments, or maybe we call it intentions, by the G20 countries in the past, which haven't really been delivered on, which sometimes are then referred to in the next statement, or which are completely ignored. We also know, of course, that in the current setting, there are some countries in G20 who unfortunately, or the governments, who unfortunately haven't really understood the problem of climate change and are not acting at all accordingly. But I think the G20, one role where I think it's still relevant is in terms of bringing those countries together and exchanging, in particular, in economic and financial matters, something which hasn't been there before in that sense. And I think it's with this green recovery and COVID-19 recovery context, of course, it puts finance ministers and planning ministers in a much more central role, and also puts them on the spotlight. And I think one thing we as civil society also need to do and can do, maybe even more strongly, is to advocate towards those and raise towards them and make them aware how much support there is for a future which is not the same as in the past. And we discussed about the inequality and so on, but also how much people depend on safe living conditions, and this is getting increasingly undermined by climate change. So I think in a way there's new opportunities to reach beyond the usual suspects, so to say, in the climate space, and make those arguments heard to those in power. Of course, we cannot take it for granted that they just follow through on that, but I think the constant pressure from all levels will still be required and useful. One interesting element which has emerged a bit in the context of G20 a couple of years ago, and which isn't receiving enough attention is also what's the role of G20 in solidarity to those countries who are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And you may know there is the so-called V20 group. And one thing that they are working on, and also with support with some donor countries, for example, is looking into, you could call it sort of climate impact protection mechanisms. Sometimes it's called insurance, sometimes social protection, depends a bit on the specific setup. But mechanisms which would deliver payouts in the event of extreme disasters, for example, in the regional context to developing countries, to vulnerable countries, whether it's in Africa or Asia. And some initial steps exist here, but I think there's, as far as I know, there's the appetite among those countries to drive that further. We as civil society should do our job to ensure as much as possible that those systems are not bypassing the poor and vulnerable people. And I think Hindu referred to some of the challenges with those people who are not registered and who may even have good reasons for not being registered by their governments. So what are innovative ways of also ensuring that those people also benefit from such, let's call it climate protection mechanisms, that they're not left without income, not left with losing their assets in the case of extreme disasters. And of course, there's a role to play for those who have been the main causes of climate change to fund those systems, to channel resources into that. So I think we should stick to those agendas and move them forward. We cannot rely on G20 always taking the next steps, but we should continuously bring that back into their attention.
Thanks, Sven, for this super comprehensive answer. And we have another question from the audience and from the chat I will pose to Samantha and Mustafa, which is, can we truly expect a transition to a green economy and to be sufficiently resilient to mass unemployment? So Samantha and Mustafa, I think you'd be the best to answer that, but everyone else feel free to come in as well.
Yes, I mean, there's no question. And I'm not just talking about the sort of traditional sectors that people are very interested in climate change think about, like coal, energy, and so on, but all sectors where you where actually both the sector, like the technology or methods of production and the jobs in almost every sector are going to have to change some in response to climate change, right? And we've heard a bit about this, everything from agriculture to electricity production in this discussion. So there's no question that the jobs are there. And there's also no question that we have actually the wealth on this planet to ensure not only social protection for everyone, and actually for everyone, but also to ensure decent jobs for everyone. I mean, what we're facing is a system that's distributing that wealth and those fundamental rights very unequally. I think I want to just mention one other issue, since you brought it up, which is the issue of migrants and other workers or other people who are unregistered in their countries, right? And this is an issue in almost every country, whether it's indigenous peoples who are pastoralists or who are nomadic, or also migrant workers, or sometimes just people who are very poor and for different reasons are not registered by the governments. Governments are trying to register people for whatever reason, and to exclude some people based on their citizenship or the kinds of documentation that they can produce. So one other interesting thing that came out of this poll that we did right before COVID is that a pretty hefty majority of people polled think everyone should have the same rights, right? So if we're thinking about what do people want, what do people think about this issue, do they think that we should be excluding and discriminating against people based on their group affiliation, their status, whether they're indigenous, whether they're migrants? The answer is no. We think also that, for example, migrant workers, people who are in countries illegally, they should have the same rights. So I just want to put that out there as another aspect of this big picture of what is the change that we want to see. Yes, we think the jobs are there. We know the wealth and capital are there. We know the technology is there. We have the solutions. And also, yes, this is for everyone, right? Just transition is about people being included in social protection and in jobs, decent jobs that were not included before.
Well, maybe I could just add quickly to what Samantha said. And I think that when it comes to a just transition to a green economy, a lot of what we've tried to do in our work has been to understand the nature and scale of changes that will happen in labor markets. And by now, I think there's a very clear understanding that when we move to a greener economy, more sustainable economy, changing our production, consumption systems, there will be new jobs created. We estimated in the last Iowa study that if countries just follow the 2-degree target of the Paris Agreement, just covering energy, renewables, energy efficiency, and transport, they can generate 24 million new jobs by 2030. But we know also that some unavoidable loss of employment will happen. So therefore, the key message is that we are on a positive narrative that moving to a green economy will deliver more jobs than it will dislocate. The challenge is that you have to treat all those people in society fairly so that we have a just transition. So the notion of just transition is that we find ways, I mean, those in charge of policies, government, workers, enterprises, communities, to find ways to maximize the opportunities for job, income creation, and minimize the risks of disruption. And so that is where policies are important. But I think it's very important that we all are on the same page, that acting with ambition on climate action will deliver more jobs. But we must be sure that those who are going to be impacted negatively, whether farmers, workers in the oil, gas industry, also are not left behind. So this transition must be in a way that everybody finds something for them in it. And if it's not done, what is likely to happen is that very powerful forces of resistance will obstruct action. You know, whether you say it's a lobbyist in the oil and gas, I don't know, even people individually. You've seen the yellow vest in France. They're not lobbyists. It's just people. People want action, but they want action that won't undermine social development and income and livelihoods of people. And it is possible to have both. It's a matter of policy coherence, and governments have to work together with communities, workers, employers, together to get this package that everybody find that this is a common direction, but it has to be just and fair for all.
Just, sorry, I wanted to react on this one also, and also what Samantha said. She touched one word which is very important for me, the rights. And I think all the decision that it can be G20, it can be from green recovery that are taking the mind of all the decisions. It must be a right-based approach. This is the missing part. They're all putting, I mean, I don't know if you look at the declaration coming from the EU or then another green recovery documents coming from other UN agencies or from the G20 or all. Not one of them mentioning that right-based approach must guide all the actions. And I think this is what is missing. If we do not include the rights of peoples in the equal way, we will have always those who are left behind. And completely right, Mustafa, we cannot have the broader social security for all the peoples if we do not have the right-based approach for all the peoples. And if we do not recognize those peoples, it's not easy even to put them or include them on the decisions. It is the same fight we are having for many years under the climate negotiations. We wanted to have the rights for peoples, and at the end of the day, they just are sending us to Geneva, and finally they say, you are right because everybody is impacted. It's right to water, it is right to development, it is right to land, it's right to so if we all push the right-based approach on the green recovery, on the new G20 focus or orientations, and maybe that can help us to include everyone and each and do not leave anyone behind. Thanks.
Thanks, Sindhu. And I mean, like with everything we heard, we kind of heard how dire the situation is for many people, but also that the solutions are there. And if I just kind of contrast all the awesome headlines you mentioned with reality and maybe the G20 are at, and thinking of the title of the session, A Fresh Start, I actually wonder if the G20 themselves would need some kind of fresh start, and want pose this question to you, and given if maybe a certain person who Samantha mentioned who received special COVID treatment, so if the openly racist president of the US is moved out of office by November, maybe we have a chance for having actually working multilateralism again. And I wanted to kind of, coming nearly to the close of the session, to pose this question to you, kind of, is there a kind of revitalization or fresh start for the G20 itself in that context for moving forward to next year, and what you really wanted to see there? Can you envision that? So maybe we can hear a last time from everyone again. So we had Hindu, then Mustafa, Samantha, Harjeet, and Sven.
Sure, you're completely right. We need to refresh back the G20, as we need to refresh all the other multilateral organizations. Of course, we benefit a lot. When we took UN, it was after the second one. Of course, we get like all the malarias that coming a general treatment for all, but still my region is left behind. Like Africa is still really struggling, and people dying more in malaria than any other diseases around the world. But when we just take the pictures of G20 members, and we take the pictures of the Security Council, who is the heart of all the UN, it looks the same people who are there. So the people who are deciding for our safety and security around the world, and those who are deciding on our economy and futures, are the same. So there is need of refreshment. Who is deciding on behalf of who? How the equity of all the countries among the world can be present there. How the inclusiveness become always a reality. How we can step from just all our countries, from developing nations, always also requesting to develop. We need to get in to a reality. We are all equal. You listen to me, I listen to you. That's very important for all of us to have this equity from the nations to the peoples. And we need to move from all the racial injustice, gender injustice, communities as indigenous peoples experiences before the colonization, to the colonization, to now. It has to be in the tables, because if we do not talk about them, we cannot resolve them. And that is also the way we are showing as civil society movement. We all come together. And when we see the diversity of this panel, it means we represent the right change that we wanted to see in the G20 in all the multilateral. And my final word will be also maybe as the call you said at the beginning. I wanted to see the world think about one thing. Maybe we can wear the mask for the COVID. Maybe we can apply the social distance, but we cannot wear the mask for the climate change. And there is no vaccine for the climate change. And indigenous peoples and my people in the Sahel are dying. It is not only our resources. We are not thinking about the job of tomorrow or the action or decision on the next 50 years as 2050 or 2100, whatever that they are projecting. We are thinking about today. We do not have time. While the people are dying, what are we waiting for? To take all the action, all the decisions. So we don't have time. We wanted to move forward. There is no vaccine for climate change. There is only a right action that can take from the G20 to all the rest of us.
Well, for me, I think one key message that I think is important in terms of refresh of the G20 is that we live in a time where leaders must be more than ever aware and responsive to the needs and aspirations of people in their time. We have reached a world with a level of inequality, injustice that is not anymore acceptable. And I think people around the world demand greater social justice. Our world needs social justice. The ILO was founded in 1919 on the grounds that there can only be lasting peace if it's based on social justice. I think we are reaching a breaking point in our economic systems, our social systems, that if leadership fails, society will collapse altogether. I think that my message is that G20 leadership around the world must be responsive to this demand, loud and clear, for more social justice in the world we live today. The world in which we live today. Thank you.
We need a new social contract, one that is focused on the things that we've discussed today. So universal rights, rights for working people, jobs, social protection, action on climate change, fair tax and wealth distribution. And we know that there's solid support from working people, from citizens, from people in most countries for this agenda. This is what people want. If the G20 is not able to deliver that at the scale and the speed that we need, and we have seen some rapid and coordinated action from the G20 during the global financial crisis, amongst other things, then we need new institutions, right? We're in this period where our old institutions are blowing apart at the seams, while at the same time, the new institutions have not yet emerged. But wherever we're going to be negotiating the new social contracts, that has got to be our agenda for the future. And the G20 is just going to be one side of struggle for that negotiation. Thanks.
If G20 remains a club that meets only to generate business and new markets for its own economies, it's not fit for purpose. That realization needs to come. We have seen recently how we are connected as a global community, how dependent and interdependent we are, and how our societies and economies are so intertwined. It's really important for G20 to set the direction and adopt principles of equity and participation, as Sindhu was also saying, and also justice, and build a safe and secure future for all. I think that's the agenda G20 has. And they need to be the leaders now, set the path and assist countries who are vulnerable to COVID, climate, and the looming economic crisis. The role is absolutely clear.
I think from the beginning, the G20 had to fight for its legitimacy and had to defend questions around that. And in the beginning, it focused a lot only on like core economic issues. But I think in this year, in 2020 in particular, and the years ahead, we see how all these different issues converge, right? I mean, green recovery and responding to COVID-19 is not the one thing or the other. It's not economic policy or climate policy, and it's not social policy or economic policy, but it all has to come together. And I think there's an opportunity for G20 to make a difference, but if it doesn't deliver, then it will put themselves more and more on the side, and other processes and other fora have to play a more important role. So I think this is really a crunch time for the G20, and we have heard a lot today what needs to happen. So now it's for the policymakers also to do their job.
Thanks very much, Sven, and thanks very much to all the panel, and thanks very much you for joining. I have not much to add, just that I hope that this session inspired you with the kind of policies and measures we can actually achieve, and that can be done. It is not easy, but it can be done. And I hope this inspired you to fight for it, to work on it, and make actually the vision of a just and fresh restart a reality. Thank you so much for joining.